June 10, 1944, 6:18. The morning smelled like wet earth and cordite, the kind of smell that got into your sleeves and stayed there. George didn't have much to say about it. He was 24, from a town small enough that the train station doubled as the post office, and he'd learned in the army that words were weight. He saved them. They were a mile inland from the beaches, tucked among Normandy hedgerows that looked like someone had stacked the countryside into walls. The platoon's job was simple: hold a crossroads long enough for trucks to keep coming through. The hard part was that, simple, never stayed simple once the sky woke up. George's machine gun sat on a low tripod in a shallow scrape behind a bank, an old, heavy gun the men treated like a stubborn animal, respectful, careful, grateful when it behaved. He'd been told to watch the road, but George watched the air anyway. Planes didn't need roads. At 6:18, a distant buzzing arrived like a swarm finding its direction. Someone called, "Aircraft," and the word snapped every head upward. Low over the fields came a single German fighter, sleek, fast, too close to the treetops for comfort, its engine note tearing the morning apart. It wasn't high enough for the big guns to catch cleanly. It was hunting the same thing they were guarding: movement, vehicles, men at a crossroads. The fighter raked the road with its own fire, kicking dust and splinters from the hedgerow. For an instant, George saw the pilot's canopy flash, glass, then shadow, then the plane slipped behind a line of trees and reappeared, angling for another pass. Men shouted, ducked, cursed. Someone's helmet rang when a twig snapped against it. George swung the barrel up, cheek near the stock, eyes narrowing into the sights. He didn't wait for an order this time. He'd learned that the sky didn't pause politely until someone in charge made up his mind. He pressed the trigger. The machine gun hammered, not like a rifle but like a door being kicked in over and over. The belt fed with a metallic snarl. Tracer rounds stitched upward in a bright, angry line, and the heat rose instantly, as if the gun itself was waking from sleep. George walked the stream ahead of the plane the way he'd been taught: don't chase it, meet it. He could feel the vibration through his forearms, through his teeth. The fighter seemed impossibly fast, but it also seemed trapped by its own speed, forced to commit to the run. At 6:23, the tracers touched the fuselage. A spark. Another. Then a thin ribbon of smoke unfurled behind the aircraft like a torn flag. The pilot tried to climb, but it was already too low, too committed. The fighter staggered, an impossible wobble in something built for clean lines, then clipped the far hedgerow. The impact was half hidden by green, but the sound wasn't: a thud and a crack that traveled through the ground into George's boots. At 6:27, a column of darker smoke rose beyond the field. For a moment, it didn't feel real, it felt like watching a painting catch fire. Men around George shouted, slapped his helmet, laughed the kind of laugh that was mostly shock. George didn't laugh. He just breathed, hands still on the grips, feeling the gun's heat bleed through metal into his palms. His sergeant leaned close, voice rough with disbelief. "You just put one down from the dirt, George." George stared at the smoke and said the first words he'd said all morning. "Maybe it flew too low." June 12, 1944, 14:41. By the third day, the crossroads had become a scar. Wheels had chewed the lanes. The hedgerows were shredded where artillery tried to prune the world into submission. The men were tired in a way that sleep didn't solve, tired in the bones, tired behind the eyes, tired of flinching every time a bird startled out of a bush. George's position moved to the edge of an orchard, gnarled apple trees, low branches, leaves trembling whenever the wind remembered it still existed. The machine gun was set with a field of fire across a shallow valley where a road ribboned between farms. The orchard smelled faintly sweet, and the sweetness felt wrong beside the ammunition boxes and the mud-caked boots. Mills, his loader, crouched beside him with the belt draped like a dull metal scarf. Mills was barely old enough to shave without cutting himself, but he'd learned to feed ammunition with a mechanic's care. He had a habit of whispering to the gun before trouble, as if it could be convinced not to fail at the worst moment. At 1441, 2 German aircraft appeared as dark shapes against the bright summer sky, dropping fast. They were hunting again, quick passes, quick kills. The first one fired rockets toward the road, exploding dirt into brown fountains. The second followed lower, almost arrogantly, as if daring the ground to answer. "Don't jam," Mills murmured. His fingers were steady, but his mouth was tight. George watched the second aircraft sweep toward the orchard line. Leaves shuddered as it passed over, the sound so loud it made the ribs vibrate. For a heartbeat George imagined the pilot could see him, 2 men tucked behind trees, 1 gun, 1 belt, nothing worth noticing. But the plane didn't need to notice to kill. George tracked it, but didn't shoot immediately. He waited, counting the rhythm of its approach, reading the way it would pull up at the last second. He'd watched enough runs now to recognize that moment when confidence turned into commitment. At 1449, George opened fire. The gun stuttered once, then settled into a steady brutal beat. Tracers climbed. The aircraft dove right into them. This time George saw a piece come off, an abrupt flake of metal tumbling away, catching sunlight as it fell. The aircraft lurched, engine note changing to a wounded snarl. It tried to bank, but the wing dipped too far. For a second it hung there, awkward as a thrown stone deciding whether to fall. Then it fell. At 1455, the aircraft struck beyond the valley near a stone barn. There was a flash, then smoke, and then a silence so strange that even the orchard seemed to hold its breath. The other plane fled upward, climbing hard, as if embarrassed by what it had witnessed. Someone behind George yelled, "That's 2." George didn't answer. He stared through the sights at the empty air where the plane had been, and his stomach twisted, not triumph, not exactly. More like the sharp awareness that luck had chosen a side for a moment. Mills exhaled loudly and laughed once, short and cracked. "George, you're going to make the Luftwaffe stop visiting." George finally let the barrel droop and said, "Good," but the word came out flat, scraped thin by fatigue. August 3, 1944, 1906. Weeks later, the unit had pushed to a river crossing, bridges wrecked, pontoon rigs creaking under the weight of ambition. Dusk turned the water to molten tin. Men worked with hammers and ropes, building a way forward while the enemy tried to erase it. George's machine gun was perched near sandbags on the near bank, aimed at the sky as much as the opposite shore. The mosquitoes were fierce. The tension was worse. Every splash in the river sounded like something approaching. Every snapping twig in the trees sounded like a footstep. At 1906, the first warning came not from eyes but from sound, a diving howl, the air itself bending around speed. A German dive bomber peeled down toward the bridge site, older and uglier than the fighters, carrying its hate in a straight line. The men on the pontoons scattered. Someone dropped a wrench. Someone prayed. Someone shouted for anti-aircraft guns that weren't there. George felt the world narrow into angles and distance. He slid behind the gun, shoulder braced, and listened to his own breathing. Mills was there instantly, hands on the belt, eyes huge but focused. The bomber came down steep, sunlight catching its wings. George didn't fire too early. He knew a dive bomber could eat bullets and still deliver its bomb. He waited until it was close enough that he could see the dark belly, the rigid geometry of its frame. At 1911, George fired, short bursts first to keep the barrel from cooking, then longer ones as the plane committed. Tracers reached up like a ladder. The bomber shuddered mid-dive. Something under its wing flashed, damage, fire, or a desperate jettison. It released its bomb anyway. The bomb fell, wobbling, and George's heart clenched as he imagined it striking the pontoons, imagined men turning into spray and silence. But the bomber's aim was ruined. The bomb splashed wide, throwing up a tower of water that drenched men and gear and left the bridge intact. The river swallowed the explosion with a brutal gulp. At 1922, the dive bomber tried to climb out, but it didn't have the strength. Smoke poured from its engine. It skimmed the far bank, clipped treetops, and vanished behind a stand of poplars. A muffled boom followed, swallowed by the valley. Men cheered, but it sounded strained, like cheering was a tool they used because they didn't know what else to do with relief. George sat back hard, the gun's heat rippling the air above the barrel. Mills patted George's shoulder without words, the way you might touch someone to prove they were still there. 3. The number felt heavy. George wished it felt lighter. December 17, 1944, 8:12. Winter brought a different war, mud turned to ice, breath turned to fog, and every sound carried farther in the cold. The Ardennes was all trees and whiteness, the kind of whiteness that made you squint and doubt your own eyes. George's unit held a defensive line along a road that cut through forest. Supplies were thin. Spirits were thinner. The enemy was pushing hard, and the sky, usually quiet in bad weather, suddenly mattered again when the clouds broke. At 8:12, 2 German fighters dropped through the opening, low and predatory. Their guns flickered, chewing bark from trees and throwing snow into bursts like white smoke. The sound was sharper in winter, as if the cold turned every crack into a snap. George's machine gun was set near a wrecked truck, shielded by its bent frame. The metal was so cold it burned his fingers through gloves. Mills blew into his hands once, then gripped the belt as if he could warm it by will. The first fighter passed too fast to catch cleanly, but the second lined up for another run, straight along the road, almost as if it believed the road belonged to it. George waited until the last possible heartbeat. He could see the plane's nose, could see how steady it was, how sure. And then he could see how low it was. At 8:20, he fired. The recoil jolted through him. Tracers cut the gray air. The fighter's nose dipped as if startled. George corrected, lifted the line of fire slightly, and saw a round strike near the engine cowling. A brief orange flare licked out, then vanished, then returned, stronger. Smoke followed, darker against the winter sky. The fighter tried to pull up, but something in its guts had already failed. It climbed anyway, stubborn, trailing smoke across the snowy treetops like an ink line on paper. At 8:29, the plane rolled onto its back, a clumsy half-loop that became an uncontrolled fall. It disappeared behind the ridge and hit with a distant concussion that shook snow from branches. The other fighter fled immediately, climbing into the cloud break as if chased by ghosts. Someone near George muttered, "That's 4, as if saying it softly might keep fate from noticing. George's hands were shaking, not from cold alone. He stared at the sky and thought about how thin a plane looked from the ground, how fragile, how final. The war had taught him numbers, and it had taught him that numbers never told the whole story. April 8, 1945, 16:03. By spring, the war felt like a door that wouldn't quite close. Everyone believed the end was near, but near had a cruel elasticity. Towns were taken, bridges repaired, roads crossed, and still men fell as if the war refused to leave without taking souvenirs. George's unit moved through western Germany, guarding a column paused near a half-ruined factory complex. The air smelled of brick dust and damp stone. A wind pushed scraps of paper along the street like nervous mice. Somewhere inside the factory, a loose sheet of metal clanged softly, repeating itself like a question no one answered. At 16:03, the lookout shouted again, "Aircraft." A single German fighter appeared, low and desperate, coming in fast, one last attempt to hurt something before everything ended. George ran to the machine gun position they'd improvised behind rubble. The gun was familiar in his hands, like a grim old friend. Mills fed the belt. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to explain. The fighter descended toward the vehicles, guns spitting. Sparks jumped from a truck's hood. Men dove for cover, their bodies pressed tight against the earth as if trying to become part of it. George tracked the aircraft across the factory's jagged roofline. He didn't think about being a hero. He thought about keeping the column moving, keeping men alive long enough to see the end. He thought about all the roads behind them, and the roads still ahead, and how every mile had been paid for. At 16:17, he fired, controlled, steady. The tracers met the plane just as it began to pull up. The fighter jerked as if hit by an invisible fist. A panel tore loose. Smoke poured out, thick and dark. The aircraft wobbled, tried to climb, then leveled out, too low, too damaged. At 16:21, it struck the far end of the factory yard, skidding through debris before erupting into flame. The sound echoed off broken walls and then faded, leaving only crackling fire and the distant rumble of the column's engines. For a long moment, no one cheered. Even victory felt tired now. Then Mills let out a breath like he'd been holding it for a year. 5, he said quietly. George sat down on a chunk of concrete, suddenly exhausted beyond anything he'd known. He stared at his hands, blackened with soot, trembling, and felt the strange emptiness behind the number. 5 planes didn't mean the war was over. It didn't mean the men already gone came back. It meant only that, 5 times, a piece of the sky had fallen because he'd been there and had done what he could. The sergeant approached, a voice softer than it used to be. "When you go home, George, what will you say?" George looked at the smoke rising into a pale spring sky. "I'll say," he answered, "that the ground can fight back." And then, as the column rolled forward again, he stood up, lifted the machine gun's barrel toward the empty air out of habit, out of caution, and finally let it rest.